separated by a fight. They went their opposite ways. But when he got an urgent call from an unknown number, he never imagined who he would find in that bed, facing life's most devastating battle. Jacob was lying in bed when his phone buzzed, cutting through the stillness of the night. The screen glowed with an unknown number, and for a second he considered letting it ring out. It was late, too late for any good news. But something made him answer. "Hello?" His voice was groggy, still thick with sleep. There was a pause, just long enough to make him think it might be a wrong number. But then the voice came, hoarse and low. "Jake, it's me." Jacob froze. He would recognize that voice anywhere, no matter how much time had passed. David? Jacob's throat tightened. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 15 years, not since his best friend had vanished from his life without a word. No calls, no texts, no explanation, just gone. For a moment, Jacob was overwhelmed by the flood of memories, the ones he had tried so hard to bury. Long summer days spent by the lake, endless nights talking about their dreams for the future. They had been inseparable, closer than brothers. But then, just like that, David had disappeared, leaving Jacob with nothing but questions and a hollow ache in his chest. "Jake," David's voice broke through the silence again, sounding weaker this time. "I need to see you." Jacob's heart raced. Why now after all these years? "Where are you?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. "The cabin," David replied, his words barely audible. "Meet me there, please." The cabin. Of course, it was the place where everything had begun, where they had spent so many summers together, making plans for the future. But it was also the place where Jacob had last seen David, before he vanished. The line went dead before Jacob could ask anything else. He stared at the phone in his hand, the familiar feeling of betrayal creeping back in. David, after all these years, had the nerve to call him out of the blue? And with no explanation? But underneath the anger was something else. Worry. David hadn't sounded like himself. There was something in his voice that Jacob couldn't shake. Something that told him this wasn't just a casual reunion. Throwing on a pair of jeans and grabbing his car keys, Jacob left his apartment, the weight of years pressing down on him as he drove through the dark streets. The cabin was just an hour away, tucked deep into the woods where no one went unless they had a reason. The last time Jacob had been there, he had sworn he would never return. Too many memories, too much hurt. As the trees closed in around him on the narrow, winding road, Jacob's mind spun with questions. What had happened to David? Why had he disappeared? And why, after all this time, did he want to see Jacob now? By the time Jacob reached the cabin, the moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The place looked exactly the same as he remembered, old, weathered, and half hidden by the overgrown trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to you long after you left. Jacob stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, staring at the cabin. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger, anxiety, and something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Taking a deep breath, Jacob walked up to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. For a second, he thought maybe David wasn't there. Maybe this was all some kind of sick joke. But just as he turned to leave, the door creaked open. David stood in the doorway, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. It was him, but different. The boy Jacob had grown up with was gone, replaced by a man who looked worn down by time. His face was thinner, his eyes darker, and there was a tiredness in his expression that Jacob had never seen before. "Jake," David said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "You came." Jacob's mind raced, 1,000 questions fighting to get out. But all he could manage was, "What happened to you?" David looked down, guilt flickering across his face. "It's a long story, but I don't have much time to explain." Jacob clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface. 15 years, David. 15 years and nothing from you. And now you show up out of nowhere, asking me to come here? Do you have any idea? "I know," David cut him off, his voice shaking. "I know I hurt you, but I had no choice." "No choice?" Jacob scoffed. "You disappeared without a word, you abandoned me." David's eyes met Jacob's, filled with regret. "I didn't want to leave, Jake, but I had to." Jacob stared at him, his heart pounding. "Why? Why did you leave?" David hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. "Because I was protecting you." Jacob blinked, confusion flooding his mind. "Protecting me from what?" David looked away, his face pale. I'll explain everything, but first you need to know. I'm dying." The words hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. He felt the air leave his lungs, his mind spinning. "What?" David took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "I don't have much time left, and before I go, you need to know the truth." Jacob stared at David, his mind struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. "I'm dying." It echoed in his head, over and over again, but he couldn't make sense of it. David, the boy who had once been full of life and energy, who had vanished from his world without warning, was now standing in front of him, asking for forgiveness as his time ran out. "What do you mean?" Jacob's voice was barely audible, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You're dying? How?" David glanced down, his hands trembling as they rested on the worn wood of the doorframe. "Cancer," he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. "I found out about a year ago. There's nothing they can do now. I've got a few months left, maybe less." Jacob felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if the weight of the past 15 years had come crashing down all at once. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had always imagined that one day David would come back and they would have time to fix things, time to rebuild what had been broken. But now that time was slipping away, and all Jacob could feel was the raw ache of loss. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jacob's voice cracked with emotion. "Why now, David? Why after all this time?" David stepped back from the door and gestured for Jacob to come inside. "Because I couldn't face you before," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And because I thought you'd be better off without me. But now, with everything that's happened, I couldn't leave this world without trying to make things right." Jacob walked into the cabin, the familiar scent of old wood and dust surrounding him. The place hadn't changed much since the last time he'd been here, but it felt different now, haunted by the weight of everything unsaid between them. As David closed the door behind them, Jacob's mind raced, trying to catch up with the moment. David gestured toward the worn couch, and they both sat down in the same spots they had shared countless summers ago. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension, until Jacob finally spoke. "What happened to you, David?" Jacob's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a frustration that had built up over years of unanswered questions. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as if he were holding on to something fragile. "I got involved with some bad people, Jake. It wasn't supposed to be like that, but it got out of control. I thought I could handle it, thought I was smarter than I really was, but I was in over my head." Jacob's heart raced as the memories of that last summer resurfaced. He had known something was off. David had been acting strange, disappearing for hours without explanation, always looking over his shoulder. But Jacob had never pressed him for answers. At the time, he had thought it was just teenage rebellion, David getting mixed up in things he wasn't ready for. He hadn't realized how deep it had gone. "What kind of trouble?" Jacob asked, his voice low, steadying himself for the answer. David hesitated, his face pale. "There were drugs," he admitted, his voice trembling. "Not for me, I wasn't using. But I was running them, moving things for some people. It started small, just stupid stuff, a way to make easy money. But it got bigger, dangerous. I didn't know how to get out." Jacob's stomach turned. David had always been the risk-taker, always looking for the next thrill. But this was beyond anything Jacob had imagined. "I wanted to tell you," David continued, his eyes filled with guilt. "But I was scared of what you'd think, scared of what would happen if you got involved. I thought I could handle it alone, that I could fix it. But then things went wrong." Jacob leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What happened?" David's voice dropped to a whisper, his gaze fixed on the floor. "There was a deal. Something went bad, and people got hurt. One of them, Mark, didn't make it." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Mark? Mark had been their friend too, part of their group. He had always been the wild one, pushing the boundaries even further than David. But after that summer, Mark had disappeared too. Jacob had assumed he had left town like David, looking for something bigger than their small world. "You didn't tell me Mark was dead," Jacob said, his voice shaking. "You let me believe he was just gone." David nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I couldn't tell you, Jake. It was my fault. I was the one who brought him into it. And when everything went wrong, I had to leave. The people we were dealing with, they weren't going to let it go. They were looking for someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. Jacob sat back, stunned. He had spent years wondering what had happened, years searching for answers. And now, to hear that it had all come down to a bad deal and a tragic accident, it was too much to take in. "You didn't have to leave me," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "We could have figured it out together. You didn't have to disappear." David wiped at his eyes, his shoulders slumped with the weight of everything he had carried for so long. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "I thought if I cut ties you'd be safe. But looking back, I see now how wrong I was. I didn't protect you. I just hurt you." Jacob shook his head, his emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Anger, sadness, betrayal, they were all there, bubbling to the surface. But beneath it all there was something else too, understanding. David had made mistakes, huge, terrible mistakes, but he had been trying to protect him. And now, here he was, standing in front of Jacob, finally telling the truth. "I don't know how to forgive you for this," Jacob admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I don't want to lose you again, not like this." David's eyes filled with tears, his face etched with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said softly. "I just needed you to know the truth before it's too late." The room was quiet, the only sound, the faint rustling of the trees outside. Jacob's mind was spinning, the weight of everything crashing down on him. But as he looked at David, his best friend, the boy who had once been like a brother to him, he realized something important. This wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about understanding, about letting go of the past and accepting the truth, no matter how painful it was. "I'm glad you came back," Jacob said finally, his voice steady. "Even if it's just for this." David smiled weakly, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Me too, Jake, me too." As a few hours passed, the weight of the conversation between them began to settle. Jacob stared out the cabin window, watching the trees sway gently in the evening breeze. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. And the golden light felt too serene for the chaos swirling inside him. David's confession echoed in Jacob's mind. Mark was gone, dead because of choices David had made. And David had carried that burden for 15 years, keeping it hidden while Jacob had been left to wonder, to hurt. The room was thick with unspoken words, but Jacob felt frozen, unsure of what to say next. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, the day when David would return and explain why he had disappeared, why he had abandoned him. But now that the moment had come, it felt hollow, bittersweet. "You should have told me, David," Jacob said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the pain behind it was clear. "You let me think you didn't care. You let me carry all of that anger for so long." David looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I know. I should have been honest with you from the start. But I was a coward. I was scared of what you'd think of me, scared of losing you for good." Jacob shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You were my best friend. I wouldn't have abandoned you." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I know that now. But back then, it felt like the only option I had left." Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as memories of their friendship flashed before his eyes. Memories of late-night talks by the lake, of plans for the future, of promises they had made to each other that they would always stick together. They had been inseparable once. And now, after all these years, they were sitting in the same cabin, but everything had changed. David was dying, and no amount of anger or regret would change that. "I don't know how to move past this," Jacob said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to forgive you for everything, for Mark, for disappearing, for letting me carry this alone." David's face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he rested them on his knees. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Jake. I never did. I just needed you to know the truth before it was too late." The room fell silent again, the only sound the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. Jacob's heart ached with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for so many years. He had been angry for so long, angry at David for leaving, angry at himself for not seeing the signs. But now, with the truth finally out in the open, that anger felt different. It was still there, but it was mixed with something else, something softer, more painful. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, Jacob admitted, his voice low. I thought I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worth sticking around for. But all this time, it was because you were trying to protect me? David nodded, his eyes full of regret. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. Jacob looked down at his hands, his chest tight with emotion. We could have figured it out together. You didn't have to do it alone. David's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I know that now. But back then, I didn't see a way out. The two of them sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared past pressing down on them. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes for the years of pain and distance that had grown between them. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like they were finally on the same page, finally beginning to understand each other again. You've got to stop carrying it alone, David, Jacob said after a long pause. You're not alone anymore. You're here now, and we've got to make the most of whatever time we have left. David smiled, a sad but genuine smile. I never thought I'd get the chance to make things right with you, Jake. I'm grateful for this, for you. Jacob nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. The words "I'm grateful for you too" sat on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say them, not yet. The pain of the past was still too fresh, too raw. But he knew, deep down, that things had already started to shift between them. The years of silence were breaking, slowly but surely. As night fell, Jacob sat beside David, who lay on the worn couch, his body clearly exhausted. The strain of their conversation, combined with his illness, had taken its toll, and David had barely touched the bowl of soup Jacob had made for him. The shadows in the cabin grew longer, and the only light came from the dim lamp beside them. David's breathing was slow and labored, and for a moment, Jacob wondered if he should take him to a hospital. But David had been clear. He didn't want to spend his last days in a sterile hospital room, hooked up to machines. He had come here to the cabin, the place that had once been a symbol of their friendship, because he wanted to die in peace. Jacob sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic rise and fall of David's chest. It was a strange thing, waiting for someone to die. There was an inevitability to it, a finality that Jacob hadn't been prepared for. But now, as he sat beside his old friend, he realized that this was their last chance, his last chance, to say what needed to be said. David, Jacob said softly, not sure if his friend was still awake. David's eyes fluttered open and he looked up at Jacob, a tired smile on his face. Yeah, I don't want you to leave without knowing that I'm here for you, Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know things have been messed up between us, but I'm not going to let you face this alone. David's smile widened, his eyes filled with gratitude. That means more to me than you know, Jake. Jacob nodded, swallowing hard as he fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. I've missed you, he admitted, the words heavy with years of pain. I didn't realize how much until now. I've missed you too, David said, his voice soft, weak. Every day. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy or tense. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the unspoken truth that they were running out of time, but that somehow they had found each other again in the end. The clock ticked quietly in the background, each second a reminder that time was slipping away. But for now, in this moment, Jacob wasn't thinking about the end. He was thinking about the fact that, after all the years of silence and separation, he and David were together again. And that, for now, was enough. The next morning, the early sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting long beams of light across the worn wooden floor. Jacob stood in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee, the comforting smell filling the air. The quiet of the morning was peaceful, but it felt fragile, as though the stillness might shatter at any moment. David was still resting on the couch, his breathing shallow but steady. His face was paler than the day before, his body weaker. Jacob could see it. David was fading. The realization gnawed at him, pulling at the corners of his mind, but he pushed the thoughts away. There was nothing he could do to stop it. They hadn't talked much since the night before, both of them sitting in comfortable silence. There was a shared understanding now, an unspoken acceptance that neither of them had the energy or the need to rehash everything. The past was the past. What mattered now was the time they had left, and Jacob was determined to make the most of it. He brought a cup of coffee over to the table by the window and sat down, staring out at the peaceful view of the lake beyond the trees. He had so many memories tied to this place, both good and bad, but now they all seemed to blur together. The laughter, the pain, the moments of pure joy, and the moments of heartbreak were all part of the same story. His story with David. David stirred on the couch, his voice hoarse as he called out, "Jake?" Jacob stood quickly and crossed the room to him. "Yeah?" David tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Jacob gently helped him, propping him up against the arm of the couch. David smiled weakly. "Thanks. I was going to ask for some water." Jacob grabbed a glass from the kitchen and brought it over, watching as David took small sips. His hands trembled, and the effort of holding the glass seemed to drain him. "You don't have to do all this, you know," David said, his voice soft. "I want to," Jacob replied, his tone steady. "I'm not going to let you do this alone." David looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I wish things had been different," he whispered. "I wish we hadn't lost so much time." Jacob sat down next to him. "Me too," he admitted. "But I'm glad we have this. I'm glad you came back." David's lips curled into a small smile, and for a moment, the two friends sat together in silence, the weight of the years between them slowly lifting. There was a peace settling over both of them, a quiet understanding that, while they couldn't change the past, they could at least find solace in the time they had now. As the days passed, David grew weaker. Each morning, Jacob woke up, knowing that their time was slipping away faster than he was ready for. He tried to distract himself with small tasks, cooking meals that David barely touched, cleaning the already tidy cabin, but the impending loss was always there, a heavy shadow looming over them. One evening, they decided to sit by the lake, something they hadn't done since they were kids. Jacob had carefully helped David outside, bundling him in a blanket as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in vibrant shades of pink and orange, and the lake reflected the colors like a mirror. "This used to be my favorite time of day," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything looks so still, like the world's holding its breath." Jacob nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't trust himself to say much. He wasn't ready to face the emotions that were bubbling up inside him. David turned to him, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "You know, Jake, I thought a lot about this place when I was gone, about us, about how simple life used to be." Jacob clenched his jaw, swallowing hard. "It wasn't that simple," he said, his voice rough, "but it was good." David smiled, his eyes distant. "Yeah, it was." The wind rustled the trees around them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was comforting, like the world was giving them a brief reprieve from the weight of everything. "I'm scared," David admitted suddenly, his voice barely audible. Jacob looked over at him, surprised by the raw vulnerability in his words. David had always been the brave one, the one who charged headfirst into everything without a second thought. Hearing him admit to fear now, after everything they had been through, hit Jacob harder than he expected. "I don't know what's coming next," David continued, his voice shaking. "I hate that I'm going to miss everything." Jacob felt his chest tighten, a wave of grief crashing over him. He had spent so much time trying to prepare for this moment, trying to be strong for David, but now, sitting here beside him, he realized he wasn't ready at all. "I'm scared too," Jacob admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to do this without you." David reached out, his hand weak but steady as it found Jacob's. "You'll be okay," he said softly. "You're stronger than you think, Jake." Jacob felt the tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He wasn't ready to cry, not yet, not in front of David. But the grief was there, just below the surface, threatening to break through. David squeezed his hand, his eyes full of a sadness that Jacob hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you," David whispered. "All those years, I'm sorry." Jacob shook his head, his voice catching in his throat. "It doesn't matter anymore. You're here now. That's what matters." David smiled again, a sad, tired smile, and nodded. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, and the colors in the sky began to fade, giving way to the soft blues and purples of twilight. "I'm tired," David said after a long silence. His voice was weaker now, more fragile. I think I'm ready." Jacob's heart clenched. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing David say it out loud made it real in a way that nothing else had. The end was near, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, one by one. The world felt still, quiet, like everything had slowed down just for them. It was peaceful in a way, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like maybe, just maybe, they would both be okay. That night, Jacob helped David back inside, tucking him into bed as gently as he could. David's breathing was labored, his face pale and drawn, but there was a calmness in his expression, a sense of acceptance that hadn't been there before. "I'll be right here," Jacob said quietly, sitting down beside the bed. David nodded, his eyes half closed. "Thanks, Jake, for everything." Jacob didn't say anything, but he reached out and took David's hand, holding it tightly as the night stretched on. He stayed there, by David's side, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, knowing that soon it would stop. But for now, he was content to just sit there, to be with his friend in these final moments. And when the morning came, David was gone. The sun had barely begun to rise when Jacob woke, the first light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the curtains. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Everything seemed still, calm, but then the weight of the previous night came crashing down on him. David was gone. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on all sides, making Jacob feel small, fragile, as though the world had shifted under his feet. He sat by the side of the bed, still holding David's cold hand, his mind unable to accept the reality of it. His friend, his brother, was no longer here. Jacob stared at David's still face, a part of him waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to take a breath, to open his eyes, to say something. But there was nothing. No more labored breaths, no more whispered words, just silence. For the first time since David had come back into his life, Jacob felt truly alone. He let go of David's hand and stood up slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was too full, too tangled to allow him any relief. He stumbled to the window, staring out at the lake as the sun began to rise, casting a soft golden light across the water. It was beautiful, serene, but the sight only made the emptiness inside him grow. Jacob had always known this moment was coming. From the second David had called him that night weeks ago, he had understood that their time together was limited, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. He wasn't ready to say goodbye, not to David, not to the memories they had shared, not to the life they had dreamed about when they were young. The grief hit him suddenly, like a wave crashing over him, pulling him under. He pressed his hand to his mouth, trying to hold back the sobs, but it was no use. The tears came, hot and fast, spilling down his cheeks as his body shook with the force of it. He had been holding it in for so long, trying to be strong for David, trying to push away the pain. But now, there was no more pretending, no more pushing it aside. David was gone, and there was no bringing him back. Jacob sank to his knees, his body racked with sobs, his mind overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the loss. All the years they had lost, all the moments they would never have. It crushed him. He thought of the summers by the lake, the plans they had made, the promises they had broken. He thought of the laughter they had shared, the fights, the nights spent dreaming of a future that now seemed so far away. But more than anything, Jacob thought of the boy David had been. The boy who had been fearless, reckless, and full of life. The boy who had been his best friend, his brother. And now, that boy was gone forever. The sobs finally began to subside, leaving Jacob feeling empty and hollow. He sat there for a long time, staring out at the lake, the world moving on without him. The sun continued to rise, the birds began to sing, and the wind rustled through the trees as though nothing had changed. But for Jacob, everything had. It took Jacob hours to move. He couldn't bring himself to leave David's side. Not yet. Eventually, though, the practicalities of death forced him into action. He had to call someone. He had to let the world know that David was gone. The first call was to the authorities, to report the death. He spoke in a numb voice, going through the motions as they asked questions and told him what to expect. Next, he called David's family, a task that felt impossibly heavy. His parents had lost touch with him long ago, and Jacob wasn't sure how they would react to the news. but it had to be done. They deserved to know. After making the calls, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. The cabin felt so much bigger without David's presence in it. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a reminder that Jacob was alone now. The weight of that realization settled on his chest like a heavy stone, making it hard to breathe. The sun was high in the sky by the time the coroner arrived. Jacob led them to the bedroom in silence, his heart heavy as he watched them wrap David's body in a sheet and carry him away. It felt wrong, so wrong, to see David like that, so still, so empty. The vibrant, reckless boy Jacob had grown up with was gone, and all that was left was a shell. Jacob stood by the door as they took David away, watching as the van disappeared down the road. The cabin was eerily quiet without him. For the first time since they had arrived, Jacob was truly alone, and the loneliness hit him with full force. He turned back to the empty room, feeling the weight of everything pressed down on him. The cabin was filled with memories, good ones, bad ones, but they all felt distant now, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to him. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to move forward from this. David had been such a huge part of his life, even in his absence, and now that he was gone, Jacob wasn't sure who he was anymore. That night, Jacob sat on the porch, staring out at the lake, the stars scattered like pinpricks of light in the dark sky. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that comes with the early signs of fall. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to find some warmth in the chilly air, but it wasn't the cold that was making him shiver. It was the grief, the raw emptiness that had settled deep inside him. He had always imagined that, one day, he and David would find their way back to each other, that they would fix things, repair the friendship they had once had. But life didn't work that way. It had been messy and complicated, full of regrets and missed chances. And now, there was no more time to make things right. Jacob had said everything he could to David in those final days, but it still didn't feel like enough. It never would. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night air, trying to calm the storm inside him. He thought about the last words David had spoken to him, the way his eyes had softened in those final moments. David had found peace, at least. But for Jacob, peace felt so far away. "I miss you," Jacob whispered into the night, his voice barely audible. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, the wind carrying the faint rustle of leaves through the trees. For a moment, Jacob let himself believe that David was still here, somewhere watching over him. But the truth was, David was gone, and Jacob had to figure out how to move on without him. The days after David's death passed in a haze. Time felt strange, a blur of long, quiet hours and moments that seemed to vanish before Jacob could even process them. He stayed at the cabin for a few days, tying up loose ends, but the silence inside those walls was unbearable. David's presence lingered everywhere. In the memories, in the shared laughter, and in the weight of all they'd been through. But David was gone, and Jacob for the first time had to face life without him. He spent hours walking around the lake, sitting by the water's edge where they'd talked so many times. The reflection on the water stayed the same, but everything else felt different. There was no more expectation of hearing David's voice, no more waiting for him to crack a tired smile. Now, Jacob was alone with his thoughts. A week after the funeral, Jacob made his way back to the city. He visited David's grave, standing there for what felt like hours, staring at the simple stone that bore David's name and a short inscription: "Friend, brother, never forgotten." He couldn't bring himself to speak, just staring at the ground, trying to make sense of the void left in his life. As the months passed, Jacob tried to get back to his routine. He threw himself into work, caught up with friends he hadn't seen in a while, but nothing felt the same. Everywhere he went, he saw reminders of David. The diner where they used to grab coffee, the trails they'd hiked as kids, even songs on the radio seemed to bring back pieces of the past. The grief was always there, hanging around like a shadow, but over time, it started to change. It wasn't the sharp, unbearable pain it had been in the beginning. Instead, it became something quieter, something Jacob carried with him wherever he went. The loss didn't disappear, but it became a part of him. Something he lived with. One evening, Jacob was sitting in his apartment, sorting through some old things, when he found a photo of him and David from years ago. They were teenagers, grinning at the camera, arms slung around each other's shoulders. The sight of it brought a smile to Jacob's face, even though it hurt. He ran his fingers over the picture, feeling the familiar sting of tears, but there was something else too. A sense of peace. "You're still with me, aren't you?" Jacob whispered, staring at the picture. He knew, deep down, that David was always going to be with him. Not in the physical sense, but in the memories, the laughs they'd shared, the lessons they'd learned together. It didn't make everything better, but it gave Jacob something to hold on to. Something that helped him move forward, little by little. With time, Jacob began to understand that the pain didn't have to define him. He had lost his best friend, but he had also been lucky to have known David at all. David, with all his flaws and mistakes, had been a huge part of Jacob's life. And that wasn't something to regret. It was something to be thankful for. He started visiting the lake again, sometimes spending the weekend at the cabin. It wasn't the place of sorrow it had been right after David's death. Slowly, it became a place of reflection, a quiet space where Jacob could think about the good times without the sharp sting of grief. 1 year after David's death, Jacob went back to the cabin for a weekend. He brought along one of David's old books, the one David had been reading before he died, and spent most of his time sitting on the porch, lost in thought. The cabin was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty, it was peaceful. Jacob knew he would never forget David. He couldn't. Their friendship had shaped him in so many ways, and he carried it with him every day. The loss was still there, but so was the gratitude. They had found their way back to each other in the end, and that was something Jacob would always hold on to. On the last night of his stay, Jacob stood by the lake, looking out at the water under the full moon. The night was cool, and the wind rustled the trees, making the world feel alive around him. He remembered the last time he and David had sat here together, talking quietly as the sun set. Jacob could almost hear David's voice in the wind. That familiar laugh that always made him feel like everything would be okay, no matter what. "I miss you, man," Jacob said aloud, his voice soft in the quiet night. And somehow, he knew David was still with him. Jacob smiled, a sad but accepting smile. He knew he would carry David with him for the rest of his life. In every step he took, every decision he made, David would be there, in the background, a part of him. With a deep breath, Jacob looked out over the lake one last time, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. It was time to move forward, not to forget, but to keep going, knowing that David would always be with him in some way. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. Life would go on, and so would Jacob. David had found peace, and now, finally, so had he. It's not over yet. Want to know how Nick was saved by someone he barely knew? Who is this mysterious florist who turned everything upside down? Click the video on your screen to uncover the shocking twist in Nick Carlisle's story.